Le coup de projecteur de l'éclaireur, Pascal Lottaz avec vous. Je reçois aujourd'hui Pascal Lottaz pour parler de la sombre situation internationale. Pascal Lottaz est professeur de relations internationales à l'université de Kyoto au Japon. Il est également le fondateur du think tank Neutrality Studies, qui possède une chaîne YouTube que nous vous encourageons vivement à regarder. Ukraine, folie européenne, désengagement américain et le Moyen-Orient qui est encore en train de s'enflammer, une situation qui d'ailleurs est peut-être plus dangereuse que la situation en Europe. C'est de ce dont nous allons parler. Pascal Lottaz, thank you so much for taking time to speak with me again. I suggest that we start with the hot stuff. What's your take on what I call the Oval Office massacre, where Trump and the J.D. Vance put Zelensky back at its place? Was it a trap set by the Trump administration, or is it a planned disengagement?
So there are several theories out there, and my take at it is that since Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance were quite cordial and quite nice to Mr. Zelensky in the beginning, and the whole dispute started only after about half an hour or more than half an hour of engagement. Yeah, so it started quite late, and it started kind of naturally because the discussion just it heated up. Mr. Zelensky at some point attacked an injection by Mr. Vance, which then Mr. Vance didn't let sit with himself. And then Mr. Trump intervened. My take is that it wasn't planned in the sense that Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance said, let's corner him. But I think it was pretty clear from the American side that they would want it to be clear that their viewpoint is that this war needs to stop and that Mr. Zelensky should accept the American viewpoint. And even if he doesn't embrace it, at least make it clear that this is the American viewpoint. And when Mr. Zelensky then didn't politely sit there and just take it, that's when the massacre and the cornering started. And it was I would have been very lost at had I been Mr. Zelensky, because you're sitting there in the Oval Office, you hear a version of what this war is about that for the last 3 years you've been denying. And you hear that from somebody who you need and want to be on your side. And then he had the choice of either letting it be and just let it go, or to defend what he thinks is the Ukrainian version of this all. And he chose to try to look good in front of his Ukrainian and European audience, and not in front of his American host. And the American host didn't let it go. And then you had this blow up.
Well, that was pretty arrogant and disrespectful from his side.
No, I was arrogant. I believe I believe I understand where this is coming from. For the last 3 years, this is the way that Mr. Zelensky communicated. And for the last 3 years, this is the behavior which got him standing ovations. This is new to him. So I don't think this was an intentional cornering of him. I think it was something that naturally developed, but it is something that maybe also just developed out of the way that these two actors are now engaging with each other. So there's two things that I wonder. I wonder why Mr. Vance didn't try to push Mr. Zelensky on Istanbul, and so why did you let Istanbul go? The potential peace agreement that they hammered out back in April in 2022. Didn't have the guts to actually tell the Americans, look, you guys pushed us into this. Because at this point it is pretty clear that Ukraine was built up to do and to be what it became over successive U.S. administrations. But of course, that would be an admission of the Ukrainian government and of Mr. Zelensky that this is not just a Russian aggression, an unprovoked one. So in a sense, Mr. Zelensky is still caught in his own narrative, and he stood up to defend that narrative. So what he doesn't understand is apparently that Mr. Trump is done with that narrative.
But then again, that was perfectly foreseeable. I mean, Donald Trump, from the onset of the war in Ukraine, has been saying that this war should never have occurred. J.D. Vance also, even before he was nominated or picked by Donald Trump as being his running mate, made a speech, I believe it was the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, where it clearly outlined that this is not going to fare well. What does that tell us of the narrative bubble these people seems to have locked themselves into?
Well, I mean, don't forget that this was not the first meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Zelensky, right? I mean, Trump knows Zelensky, at least also from, actually, I'm trying to remember, does he know him from before? As Mr. Zelensky came in 2019.
He does.
But they didn't know from that time. And also Mr. Zelensky met Mr. Trump, I think it was November, before or after, shortly before or shortly after the election, and I forgot which one, but they met at Trump Tower, if I'm not wrong. And then there the cameras were not rolling, and they had a short announcement in front of the cameras, but it was all very short. But they met about 3 months ago, and I suppose that at that time Mr. Trump was very vague at the time after the meeting, but he also expressed support for Mr. Zelensky back then. So I suppose that Mr. Zelensky was still meeting Mr. Trump under the impression that with enough nudging, you can get where you need him to be. And don't forget, like Mr. Macron and Mr. Starmer, they went to Washington just a few days earlier, like Monday and Thursday, right? Before on Friday, Mr. Zelensky met with Mr. Trump in order to soften him up, right? In order to try to sell the European standpoint, which is that the Americans need to give a guarantee not to Ukraine, but they need to give a guarantee to the UK and to France to function as a backstop, which in effect would be exactly the same, right? The problem is that French
backstop or this. But this backstop, so sorry for interrupting, but this backstop and these guarantees are the very root cause of the war in the first place, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, they're not the root cause for the war, but they would be the root cause for the enlargement of the war, right? The root cause of the war is the successive militarization of Ukraine against Russia, which Russia said must stop. You must end this. There's other causes. There's also the Donbas. There's also the language and the policies of Ukraine. There's also the unwillingness of Ukraine to provide a proper societal space for the Russian speakers in the East. Right there's other issues as well. But the main issue, the security issue, is the transformation of Ukraine into a dagger, an attack dagger that can be used against Russia. And so in this sense, this military component, the backstop, yes, is a continuation of that policy or that process. And yes, the Americans absolutely correctly said, and Mr. Trump correctly said, that if we do this, this might lead to World War III. And you're playing with the Third World War if you try to drag us into this war. So the war needs to stop. It doesn't need to it must be stopped from getting worse. And creating these mechanisms, the French will go in and help you, and then we go in and help the French and the British, that will just enlarge the war. And he and Mr. Trump clearly and without any doubt sees that. But that's still what Mr. Zelensky wanted to get and squeeze out of Mr. Trump. And that's where the discussion then exploded. And honestly, I'm glad it did. And not just because I think it would be World War III if that happened. It's also because the issue that they were there to do this mineral deal was an absolutely horrible deal. I'm very glad for Ukraine that it didn't sign that, because this was also a ludicrous idea on the side of America in order to bind itself to Ukraine, but extract from Ukraine a price which I think is absolutely outrageous. So in a sense, this deal itself seemed to me very unhelpful. So I'm actually glad it didn't happen. I just don't know whether that was part of the plan of the Trump administration to actually let the deal go, because right now the talk is that, of course, Mr. Trump and Vance are furious that this agreed upon little contract didn't happen. But to me, it would be a very bad contract, and I don't see how this contract would make the situation better. Although there's also talk about this contract being meant as leverage for the United States to say, like, now we have a stake in Ukraine, and now we demand of you, Ukraine, to sit down with the Russians and come to an agreement so that we can realize our stake in this project. There must be thinking on this kind of level. It's just not entirely clear to me, and I think it would have been a very bad situation for Ukraine. Although anything that ends the war is better than what there's now. Don't get me wrong on that. Anything that helps to end the war is better than the current situation.
Okay, about this deal, I mean, the picture is a bit blurry. I mean, because one, it was not about just extracting things out of Ukraine, because the US put $500 billion on the table with that deal, okay? That's what it is about. You give us mining rights and we pay you $500 billion.
Well, you know, it's a bit of a joke to me that after 3 years of war, when the deal was we do the paying and we give you the implements of war, and you, Ukraine, you do the bleeding, and you use our implements of war and you go and slaughter the Russians. Now, after 3 years, Mr. Trump says, "Oh, that was not just money that we gave you. That was a loan, so you have to repay the loan."
These were loans. All of it is Lend-Lease. It was voted by the U.S. Senate. That's the point. I mean, keep in mind that the UK paid back its Lend-Lease for Second World War, or finished to pay it back in 2006. It is a Lend-Lease. I mean, if you want to give money to Ukraine, for instance, in France, you need a law to do that. No law were passed on that. So this has to be loans.
But just imagine, I mean, this is where I just think that Ukraine is the greatest victim of this entire situation. Just imagine this. You lost all of these people, and then, you know, the idea that this was like shiploads of US dollar cash that went to Ukraine is also ridiculous, right? What is this money? This is money that was paid by the US government to US contractors who then delivered the weapons that they used. This was money that was directly injected into the US economy. A part of it went to Ukraine.
So was it during the First World War and the Second World War?
It is, which just makes the situation more ridiculous. It's like this is one of the reasons why the US had such an economic boom over the last couple of years. You know, this is a war economy that then thrives on the public spending. It is military Keynesianism for the good part of the US and European military sector. And Ukraine is doing the bleeding on all sides. And the outcome of this is then to tell Ukraine that now you also need to give us more of your resources. That's also the thing. We will not accept your worthless paper money. We gave you paper money. We gave you weapons in the form of putting paper money into our economy. We are not going to accept your paper money in return. What we want is your mineral wealth and other forms of wealth that you hold in your country, like physical assets. This is just neocolonialism of the worst form, and the fact that the Ukrainians can't see that yet worries me deeply. I mean, okay. On the other side, you have somebody who literally shoots and fires rockets and bullets at you. I do understand from the Ukrainian side that you have bigger problems than worrying about paying back loans. But it's a huge tragedy, and I wonder how long it will take until the Ukrainians get so mad with the Americans and with the Europeans that they will actually be more angry at them than at the Russians and come to a negotiated end.
But again, this mineral deal, Zelensky is the one who put it on the table over 6 months ago, both to the Americans and to the Europeans. He did that, and why did he do that? He did that because he's fully aware that over 80% of all of Ukraine's extractive resources are located in the Donbass, which means if you want to exploit them, you're going to have to reconquer the Donbass, militarily speaking. So that's also one way to drag NATO into a war with Russia.
Yes.
Which he has been trying to
do.
Which he has been trying to do since he was elected in 2019.
Yeah. And plus, the whole idea was to tie future American aid to these minerals. But Mr. Trump flipped this on its head and said, no, it's for past U.S. aid that you have to give that up to us. So it backfired hugely on him. But yeah, you're right. I mean, one of the incentives there from the Ukrainian side was to say, like, let's bribe the Americans into continued support. And it hugely backfired. But again, it would have been very, very bad for Ukraine. I believe that had come true. On the other hand, it's now not getting any better. And what needs to change is the attitude toward negotiating with Russia. But this is not just a Ukrainian problem. This is a European problem. This insane discussion now of the Brits and the French of still sending troops to Ukraine and expecting that this will somehow turn the tide, when what all this will do, and Mr. Starmer said so, right? Boots on the ground and planes in the sky. I mean, sorry, your planes are going to be on the ground and your boots are going to be under the earth if you do that. It's just that's.
Oh, and Lavrov said it very clearly. I mean, they will see any peacekeepers as
of course
targets.
I mean, of course, that's what you do. You don't mean. And again, this is not up to the Europeans to decide how the Russians are going to perceive the European and quote unquote peacekeepers. This is obviously, if you send your military troops into a battlefield where the other party has time and again said we will treat you as party to the conflict, then it's not up to you to say like, oh, but that's not what they are. They're just there to help and save and so on. They will be shot at. They will be killed. So if you want that British troops and you want dead French troops, then please do that. But then my recommendation to the British troops and the French troops is don't go. Don't let anyone send you to your certain grave, because the Russians, we know that they will not give up. Again, Europe, the French lost against the Russians 200 years ago. The Germans lost against the Russians twice. Do you really want to try a fourth time in 200 years? Do you really want to try? I mean, you're going to suffer the same fate again. So please, British and French and Europeans have a sense for history and stop trying to fight the Russians in places where the Russians said this is existential to us. So stop it.
What do you make of the European attitude? Are these people batshit crazy or what?
They are batshit crazy. They are either lost that far in their own narratives that they cannot maneuver out of it again, and they horribly overestimate what they can do. I mean, the Brits still live in a fantasy world in which they are, the other superpower next to the United States, where they are, the part of the global police force. France probably also still lives in its colonial past. Yes. La Grande Nation. I mean, what the Europeans still live like in a past that has not just finished in the last decade, but that has finished 100 years ago, and they can't see it. They can't see also that they don't have the industrial capacity anymore. Because one more thing the Americans did successfully is to deindustrialize Germany, the Brits, and the French. It's like, it is over continental Europe. You might gain this back in like 30, 40 years. But right now you have neither the military nor the industrial base in order to even at 50% stand up to the Russians. The last 3 years, the Russians have destroyed not just the Ukrainian army, but the entire military backbone of NATO in Ukraine. This was a war of attrition, and the Russians have successfully outperformed and outproduced the Europeans, and that the Europeans don't see that just speaks to their utter blindness. I'm still not sure where this blindness is coming from, but I think at this point it is willful blindness, and we're going to pay this dearly if we don't get out of this mindset, because at some point this war might still spill over, and send the Brits and the French sending troops in there, that is the spillover, right? And if then these troops get killed, the Brits and the French are going to say like, the Russians attacked us unprovoked. No. If you send troops and these troops get killed,
I don't think it's going to fare well.
It's not going to fare well. It's horribly dangerous, because let's not forget, actually, both of these nations, France and Britain, they do have nuclear weapons. And despite us saying that France and Britain are not in a position to fight a war, they still have nuclear weapons, and that is a dangerous situation. So this is a mix that we should not try out.
Yeah, but the Brits, you get the double key, so they can't fire any of their nukes without the US prior approval. This is why Macron is stepping up, saying, we're going to share our nuclear deterrence, which cannot be shared, both from a strategic standpoint, but also from a legal and political standpoint. So we are indeed led by madmen. You spoke about changing the mindset. Do you really think it's possible? I mean, wouldn't it be more simple to change the personnel?
Yes, I wish the personnel was changeable soon enough. Unfortunately, in all of the biggest states of Europe, you have a political setup which, in the top positions, leaves only different versions of the same mindset, right? I mean, whether in Germany you have a SPD chancellor or a CDU chancellor really only makes a marginal difference in foreign policy terms. A big difference would be an AfD or a BSW chancellor, but those just don't have enough support, with an aggregated 25-30% maximum, right? It's just not enough. In France, something that would make a change would be probably Marine Le Pen. I'm not saying that this is something I would want. I'm saying that is what probably would bring the biggest foreign policy change, right? But also there, the support isn't big enough for various reasons, right? In France, the political elite is also such that, I mean, maybe with a Monsieur Mélenchon, maybe there would be a change, but also there, the electoral, the weight, right, of this possibility is just too low. So we cannot hope for a change of personnel short of a revolution in any or several of these states. But what we can hope is that at some point reality kicks in, to something that actually makes the Europeans understand that necessity is the mother of innovation, and that they need innovation in the form of policy innovation, that now they have to deal with a new reality. For instance, if tomorrow actually the Ukrainian army starts to really collapse, like seriously collapse, and you have pictures of soldiers like fleeing and running for their lives and massively, and the Russians basically in 5 days then occupying Kiev, and this time it being a real occupation and being done and just over, then that would maybe lead to a change, because the Europeans would have to accept that there's a new reality on the ground. This is not the only thing that could happen, but something that would shock the narrative, because the narrative right now is still that if we just give Ukraine one more wonder weapon and one more $1 billion, then the Putin regime is going to collapse under its own weight, right? That's still the mindset of these people. And remember, the mindset of many people in Germany in the Second World War was that mindset until basically March 1945, until the Russians stood in Berlin, right? This is a psychological effect, right? That the more you start losing a war, the more these "we will win" pronouncements will get traction, and the worse the situation get, the more the political stakeholders whose physical survival depends on not losing will tell everybody that we're going to win in the end. We're going to turn it around. We'll turn it around tomorrow. And this process is also underway right now with the Europeans. They are losing. The Americans understood that, and Mr. Donald Trump is trying to walk away and is trying to cut his losses, and the Europeans, who have more to lose than the Americans, they dig in because the situation is getting desperate. But once the situation gets the situation will get to a point where even the Europeans are not able to ignore it anymore. I mean, at some point, Adolf Hitler could not ignore anymore that his bunker was under attack. And that's the point where he killed himself, because it got so clear what was happening. I hope that the Europeans don't have to kill themselves, and I hope that they just get to the point where they realize, okay, we got to change policy. It's not working. But at the moment, they're still dreaming that it's going to work if they just do a little bit more of the same failed things that they did for the last 3 years.
Well, in that case, are NATO and the EU dead?
These institutions have often the propensity to live on and to shift shapes. So I don't think that they're dead. I think that NATO, the United States, even if the United States leaves NATO and might take, Canada with it, NATO would probably still live on and change into a European military organization or into an EU military arm. Don't forget that even countries that are highly critical of NATO that are highly critical of what happened in Ukraine and are highly critical of the approach taken by Brussels and the NATO headquarters, like Hungary and Slovakia, both of them are still not ready to leave NATO. They still prefer to use NATO as part of their security strategy. Even Viktor Orban, right? He still sees, the Hungarians see value in NATO, and so do a lot of all European NATO states. So I would rather think that NATO will probably change its face and shift on, if the Americans stay part of it, then as well it will probably shift. The EU, I'm very unhappy with where it is today, but short of a direct war with Russia, I do think the EU will probably survive. I would hope that it will be seriously, comprehensively reformed, but what I don't see is that you will have an exodus of countries, right? We had a Brexit that was very impactful on the EU. As long as France and Germany remain part of the EU, I think it will remain on the face of the European continent. And I don't see the French or the Germans wanting to walk away from it, at least not under the current electoral balances.
Oh, yes. In France, yes. If you ask the French, do you want to leave the EU? You're going to have 60% of people saying yes.
Yeah, but you don't have the political parties who would support that. So the question is,
on a referendum, there's no question of political party. If you take a look what happened in 2005, but political parties were overwhelmingly in favor of the European Constitutional Treaty, and the French said no.
Yeah, but don't forget, in Europe, except for like my country, Switzerland, and so on, we don't live in direct democracies. We live in managed democracies, right? Where we, the people, get to elect the figureheads who get to represent us. And then these people get usually, quite often, don't represent properly the interests of the majority on the ground. So what I'm saying is that in the current in the current landscape, where we have political parties that govern us.
Oh, you mean the institutional landscape?
On the institutional landscape, we don't have the majorities in order to divorce either the French or the Germans from the EU. And as long as this EU marriage of these two states remains, the EU will remain. Now, and I am overall, I must say, the EU has its good moments, because internally it manages to keep potential rivals married to each other, right? This is a good thing that for the last 80 years there was never talk again of war between France and Germany. That's a very, very good thing. But it's as an institution, it is now such a Frankenstein that it's really hard to see how this is going to maintain European democracy. It's rather doing the opposite. It's starting to be a tool of repression against large parts of millions of people on the European continent, and that That has to change.
No, I don't think it will, unfortunately. But
I mean, the thing is, the European continent needs to live together somehow. There needs to be some form of arrangement to make sure that the Europeans are not at each other's throat and that they can trade with each other. And the current model is the EU. Now, it would be nice if maybe you can dial it back a little bit and make it more into something like an ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is a much looser club.
It's very simple to make. I mean, you dismantle the European Commission, European Parliament, and the European Court of Justice, because we don't need that actually to run a customs union or to run common policies. We do not need that. I mean, all great European achievements, I'm thinking about Airbus, Arianespace, were not born out of the European Union or the European communities, as was named at that time. It was done through intergovernmental cooperation. I mean, people that wanted to cooperate.
Yeah, I agree. So the goal of the European Union should be dialed back. Let's not forget that it was made at a moment when some people had the idea of creating the United States of Europe, right? That was the ideal to create a super state, a supranational state. And in a sense, giving up a little bit of the state power into a higher organization had its merits, but it has definitely run itself out and ran again against this wall that Europe often runs against, that as soon as you have people who want to unite the continent, they first try to do so with very sweet and lovely words, and then they start doing so with repression, and in the end they will do so with weapons if they don't get their way. And the European Union is now at stage 2 of 3, and we need to make sure it doesn't get to 3, but we can dial it back to 1. So yes, I think getting rid of much of the supranational elements of the EU would make good sense.
Well, that's always the question between sovereignty devolution and sovereignty transfers, which is not the same. What you devolve, you can take back if you're not happy with it without any consequences. For others, when you transfer sovereignty, you end up back up against the wall. Anyway, you're located in Japan. Okay, how is this whole, mind my French, clusterfuck perceived on your continent?
Very differently in different parts. So I was just today also talking to Indonesian friends, colleagues, and the Indonesians are clearly looking at Europe and they shake their heads. And it's like, how is it possible that you guys cannot wake up to your own, to the realities on the ground and to the multifaceted ways in which this conflict is obviously very complicated? How can you try to boil it down to a narrative of good versus evil when obviously there's so much more behind it? And that's the Indonesians who see that, and they cooperate with they still talk and cooperate with Russia. They talk and cooperate with China. They try to understand the terrain that they're working on, while they see from Europe that Europe is obviously at a dead end, right? Also, if it's the historical development. Japan interprets the war in Europe much more through the lens of the Americans and through the lens of also what we are used to in mainstream media, but they do so on a much lower emotional level. I see that many Japanese condemn Russia and Vladimir Putin for his actions. At the same time, they don't. I can't feel the visceral hate for Russia over here. I can't feel this strong emotions. So and you still have a good number of Japanese over here who would want to have rather de-escalatory rhetoric and politics, and the Japanese also, when it comes to the Chinese, they try to engage them also in discussions and debates, and they are very, very unhappy about the potential clash between the Americans and the Chinese. So Japan is in this sense a bit more nationalistically minded than, let's say, the Europeans, who over the last 25-30 years have basically given up national interests in the favor of transatlantic interests, right? Where everything is subsumed under the transatlantic alliance. The Japanese, they clearly think in terms of US-Japan alliance, but the reason of that is the interest of the state of Japan. And that interest still guides also a lot of the policy thinking. And one of the interests is not to have a war in this region. So the question then is, what's the interpretation of how to maintain this security? And that's where I'm, in my view, a good part over here, underestimates the negative role that the United States can play, or overestimates that their protector function. On the other hand, they right now the Japanese are losing faith in the US, not because they think the US has pushed Ukraine into this war, but because they think that presidents like Donald Trump, and might not be the last one, and the US is not a reliable partner anymore. He's not predictable. The Japanese hate it when things are unpredictable and unpredictable characters, and the US system is now proving much less predictable than before, and that is something that alienates them. When it comes to the Europeans, Europe is such a difficult political case to interpret that I don't think the Japanese will continue this idea of trying to get closer to NATO. I think this has now. I hope it has reached its end. Also, again, because of this predictability factor.
Okay, now let's shift, if you will, theater, and let's turn to the Middle East, where the situation is also dire and potentially more dangerous than what's happening in Ukraine. Because we have a full-out war. We did definitely see that Syria is going down the path of Libya. What do you think is going to happen there? Because we do see that the Netanyahu government seems not to change course, a bit like Europeans are doing. And we're saying that Israel also behaves like Ukraine. Being sure that they will have US support no matter what they do. That has the potential of prompting a huge regional war. We've seen, for instance, that Egypt has massed 50,000 troops at the border of Israel. My question is, from the American standpoint, managing or resolving the Ukrainian issue as soon as possible may be a way to avert this regional war in the Middle East, don't you think?
I'm not sure, and because the power dynamic in the Middle East is, to me, much less clear than it is in the case of Ukraine. Ukraine is, in this sense, much simpler, because the warfare itself is contained on a physical area, and it's contained to at least more or less the armies of two states plus their proxy supporters, at least for Ukraine, right? But it's the delimitations are clearer, much clearer than what it is for the Middle East, because in the Middle East, West Asia, I still don't understand. There's still a debate whether it is Israel that's running the show in Washington, or whether Washington is actually abusing Israel as its attack dog in the Middle East. A lot of people that I tend to trust, whose judgment I tend to trust, especially John Mearsheimer and so on, they clearly see Israel as through the lobbying efforts and the structural role of the different groups in Capitol Hill as outsized and being able to but to threaten senators and congressmen and women in general who do not fall in line with the interests of Israel, and therefore also through the donations and so on even influence Donald Trump's policy toward the Middle East. Then there's other thinkers who say, no, at the end of the day, it's the United States that if it puts its foot down, Israel will have to fall in line. And we had some indications for that as well. I mean, Netanyahu wasn't willing to stop the genocide in Gaza for 1.5 years until more or less Donald Trump made it clear that now a ceasefire is expected, and his envoy actually went to negotiate there. One more thing that we are seeing at the moment is that since January, Israel is currently not escalating with Iran. Do you remember how close we came to a war with Iran the entirety of the last year, several times, and each time it was because Israel did something more that was unthinkable before, right? With an attack on Iran's embassy in Damascus, then with assassination. As an assassination of one of the highest dignitaries and diplomats of Hamas in Tehran. I mean, all of these provocations were huge, and right now, since the election of Donald Trump, this has stopped, at least for now. So I would hope that the Americans are putting pressure on Israel to not escalate with Iran. But I can't be sure. We can't be sure. One more thing is that Netanyahu just manages time and again to get his remain in the political process, and he does so over the death of many people. But Netanyahu is actually not the most radical figure in Israel's political process. There's people who are even more bloodthirsty and who want to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and annex even more territory. And we've seen how even more territory has been occupied now by Israel in Syria. So Israel is clearly still totally out of control and totally on a path toward more warfare in West Asia. I just don't know I can't properly understand what the power dynamics between the US and Israel is. So it's much murkier.
Public opinion has shifted in the US, and there's something that we tend to underestimate is the fact that the bulk of the pro-Israeli lobby in the US is not Jewish. These are evangelists, and they don't care about Netanyahu, or they don't care about the Kahanists, like Ben Gvir or Smotrich. So my question is, once the Ukrainian problem is resolved, because it will be resolved, I mean, whether Europeans like it or not, and it will not be resolved on the European terms. Don't you think that Trump may do to Netanyahu and his gang the same thing that he has done to Zelensky?
I would hope so, but I don't know. I mean, we know that he has professed much more friendship to Netanyahu and to in general to the Israelis than he has to the Ukrainians, right? I mean, there's clear difference.
He had an election to win. I mean, now he's there. He's got 5 years. That's his last term. He knows that.
I would hope so. I just don't see the indicators for that. I mean, he already had won his elections his first term, and he relocated the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Israel. Huge victory for Netanyahu, huge victory for the nationalists. He recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel that officially belonged to Syria, right? And he didn't have to do that. That was not necessary back then, and so those are the indicators to me that he will have a much more Israel-friendly policy than he now has a Ukraine policy, right? I'm just not very hopeful, although I would hope that he will be a strong man for peace in the Middle East and not a strong man for more warfare as the Israelis wish.
Well, thank you. We've gone through everything. I mean, that's the outlook is not good. Let's face it.
Well, I don't know. Overall, let me put it this way. If Kamala Harris had won the election, I would be way more pessimistic than I'm now. At least now we have a chance for a serious policy change. Although, I mean, it might turn out completely different, but at least there's a chance for it, because under Harris, it's pretty certain everything would have continued the way it did in the last 4 years.
Basically, it all relies on Donald Trump's capacity to clean up the U.S. federal government.
It does, to an extent. It also there's also, I mean, let's not underestimate also Russia's the Russia factor when it comes to the Middle East and the new relationship between Russia and Iran, and let's not underestimate China. But the three great powers that we have now determine most of what we're going to see in world politics over the next decade or so, and it's a scary thought, but it's a reality. And the biggest power of them all is still the United States, but the United States at the moment is also a loose gun. We just don't know, a loose cannon that might take down the ship if the ship rocks really hard. So I do hope that at some point we get to more self-restraint again. I just don't see the indicators for that to happen anytime soon.
Pascal Lottaz, thank you very much.